Hitchens,
Yeah.
Christopher Hitchens' brother.
Yeah.
But during that one, Skype messed up the audio, so no one could hear him for most of the conversation.
Oh, wow.
But he was coming
That's
through my
terrible.
headset perfectly fine, so I could hear him.
But nobody else.
Yep. So I had to like move the microphone from my mouth to the ear so that he could like they could hear the audio from
Right.
my mic from my headset. So I was like, oh,
I've had a few snafus myself with some big guests, find out that my regular mic isn't on and some rinky dink camera mic is on. And so I sound like I'm in an echo chamber,
yeah, God, why can't someone just fix all this for
I
us? Come
know.
on, YouTube.
Yeah. Yeah. There's been some challenges too. I don't know if you ever were using the Google Hangouts for YouTube, but that was nice at first. But then when it went away, you just had to figure it out on your own, and that's when things got a little bit more difficult for me. So
Yeah, that was crazy for people. Like everyone was using Google Hangouts because it was so easy, and then they just shut it off and like, oh, now you just figure stuff out. Good luck on your
yeah,
own. Find some new
exactly.
service.
Yeah.
Uh, all right, sound seems good. Got some comments in. All right, looks like we're good.
Good.
So, Michael, thanks for coming on, for being willing to have a conversation with me. I appreciate you taking the
Yes,
time
sir.
to come on my channel. You run the Reason in Theology YouTube channel and discuss a lot of really complicated stuff that I have no idea what you're talking about in theology. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself and your channel before we get started?
Yeah, yeah. And by the way, thanks for having me on. So yeah, my name is Michael Lofton, the founder of Reason in Theology. I have master's in theology from Christendom, working on a doctorate right now in theology. Been a Christian, practicing Christian since 2006. And yeah, we have the channel Reason in Theology where we engage just all kinds of people from uh, other Catholics to Orthodox to Protestants, Muslims, atheists, you name it. So we kind of have everything on the show.
Cool. So you said 2006. That's a pretty recent
Yeah.
conversion. What were you before you were a Christian?
Well, nominally a Christian then, but not practicing. And a little bit before that, I was nominally Jewish because my mother brought us to Israel. I actually lived there twice, so she took us there a second time, and we converted to Judaism. So I practiced it, loosely as a kid, and then became a Christian again. Kind of a nominal experience, but it wasn't really anything I practiced a whole lot. But at the age of 22, that's when things really changed, and that was 2006. So that's kind of where I really count my Christian background.
Yeah, cool. So I'm an atheist, by which I mean I believe there are no reasons to believe in a God. I
Yeah.
converted when I was sometime late high school-ish because none of my
Mhm.
prayers were ever answered, the typical problem of suffering. Could you tell me some of the reasons you believe there are for belief in a God? And I'd like to tell you my position on those and hear your thoughts on my position.
Sure. And I totally get where you're coming from, especially with the suffering part. I think that's the strongest objection to a deity, especially a loving deity. I think that's where really a good case can be made. But anyways, I digress. Back to me. Um, as far as me, number one, it's an experiential thing. Like I said, in 2006, I had a very, very profound experience, and that's when I began to take it seriously and actually really believed that there is a God, and it manifested itself in my life. So first and foremost, I would say it's an experiential argument. Now, that's not going to be very convincing to other people who haven't had the same experience, right? So I recognize that. I understand that. But I'm going to be frank. That's the driving force behind, my position because I had that experience. Now, of course, I can point to some philosophical and reasonable arguments for a deity, but that is not going to get a person from atheism to theism, in my opinion, because I think more is needed than just pure reason. If we could just go at things neutrally, I think that would be sufficient. But I don't think that anybody approaches this just purely neutrally. So I don't think it's adequate. But I think some of the ones that have been impressive to me, the argument from contingency and the argument from motion, of course, from Aquinas. And I'm sure you've heard them a million times, and you have your objections to them. And I totally get that. And at the end of the day, again, I think that if we approached it neutrally, I think it would be sufficient to say there is a deity. That doesn't necessarily get us to the Christian God, however, it just gets us to kind of a basic generic God. Um, but even then, I still don't think that we approach it neutrally. So I don't think that that's really going to convince anybody. As if somebody's going to hear the argument and really is going to have an actual conversion. Now, I do think that it's possible, God could use that as a means to convert a person, but he usually doesn't. I think he usually uses other means to convert people, experiences rather than just, reasonable knowledge.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I totally agree that experience is the most powerful thing. That was what made me an atheist, was the lack of experience. So
Yeah.
I don't usually try to debate people's experience because it is so personal, and it's
Yeah.
kind of just pointless to even begin to
Yeah.
because it's so powerful for each individual.
Sure.
But I disagree with you where you say if we were approaching this neutral from a neutral standpoint, we would come to the
Yeah.
position of a god. From my belief is that if we approached it neutrally, we would come to the position of atheism.
Sure.
So the
Yeah, I understand that.
arguments, yeah, the arguments you presented specifically, like the contingency argument, like I can grant that there is a necessary thing by that definition, but that doesn't tell us anything about a god. It doesn't need to be a necessary conscious thing of any kind. So it seems like we can have
Yeah.
that without a god.
Yeah, so I mean, then we have to go to other proofs, right? Just saying that there is a being that is absolutely necessary doesn't, in and of itself, get you to a personal God. It doesn't, in and of itself, get you to a good God. It doesn't, in and of itself, get you to a beautiful God or a true God or one God as opposed to multiple. There are then other proofs that we have to walk through for each one of those, which I think Aquinas does well in the Summa, the first part, prima pars. Um, but again, there's a whole lot of work that has to be done there. Um, you know, there's a lot of work that to get to the idea that there's one God, that he's good, that he's absolutely simple, and so on. A lot of other proofs. The argument from contingency only itself gets us to the idea that there is a being whose existence is identical with his essence, or essence is identical with essence, who is absolutely necessary, and then explains everything else that's contingent. That's all it gets us to. But that's more than an atheist is going to hold to, in my estimation. I don't know any atheist who holds to an some being out there, whether personal or not. Doesn't matter. I don't know any atheist who holds to a being that's absolutely necessary. Now, maybe you do, but you'll be the first person that I've ever talked to who believes that.
All right. In my context, absolutely necessary is synonymous with energy, the first law of energy, conservation of energy. Energy cannot be created or destroyed. So, from my worldview, energy is the necessary thing. And most physicists would agree with me on that point. So, adopting the Thomistic language, I can use the necessary identity and just apply that to energy and say energy is the necessary thing. So, I would agree there is a necessary being in that sense.
What makes energy absolutely necessary? That's where I'm lost.
It's
Help me out there.
it's not contingent. It cannot be created or destroyed. It is absolutely
I,
necessary.
I agree. It can't be created or destroyed by us. I mean, I agree. It's there. But what about the essence of energy makes its essence and existence identical? What about energy equals that it absolutely must exist? See,
Uh,
that's where I'm lost.
yeah, so it'd be kind of like using the Thomistic argument of potentiality, like anything that has some kind of potentiality has the ability to like manifest some alternate state or whatever. That potentiality is just a necessary quality within energy. It's what energy is. So the actuality to allow that potentiality is just energy. That is the definition of energy. So energy is that actualized state that allows for potential given the Thomistic language.
I mean, something that goes from potentiality to act has to be put in the act. And that prior something has to be act purely. Otherwise, we're going to have to say, where did it get its act from? Right. And it's just going to go on forever. Well, so we're going to have to say there's something that is absolute act. And I guess I'm not saying how energy is pure act and absolutely necessary. I guess I'm still not seeing that.
Well, how so? How would God meet that criteria? How would you answer that from a God's perspective?
Well, since we do see things that are contingent, and since we do see things that go from potency to act, we have to logically conclude that there has to be something that would be absolutely identical to act, absolutely identical to essence in existence. I'm sorry, to set all of these things into motion, to put anything from that is in potency to act, and to anything that is contingent to actually make it. there has to be something that's not contingent, that is absolutely necessary. It's just a logical conclusion. If we see potentiality, and I'm speaking here about two different arguments, because going from potency to act is one thing, and I'm kind of having to mix them together since we're talking about both. But that's one set of proofs that we could deal with. The other is again the argument from contingency. That's another set. They are related, but they are distinct. If there is something that is contingent, and we all agree that there is, then there must be something that is not contingent, that is absolutely necessary, that could account for these things that are contingent. You talk about energy, but what is it about energy that makes its essence identical to its existence? There is no such, I don't see it. But we talk about God, a being whose essence is identical to his existence as he's simple. That does then explain things that are contingent. So again, it's a logical conclusion based upon what we experience here with our senses. Since we're experiencing things that are contingent, everything I encounter in this world is contingent. There's nothing about energy that tells me it absolutely has to exist. It does exist, but there's nothing about it that tells me it absolutely must exist, because the essence of energy is not existence itself. I don't
So
know anybody who would claim that.
most physicists, well, they wouldn't use the same terminology because they don't use the Aquinas terminology, but they would use that same definition that energy can't not exist. That is kind of a necessity. But
Um,
how is God the same, the essence and existence? Just by definition, because you define him that way?
Again, because if we encounter something that is contingent, there has to be a necessary explanation. There has to be a being that whose essence is identical to its existence to account for contingent things. And this is what we call God. That's what Aquinas is talking about in the Summa. He's using a logical set of proofs and showing this necessarily follows. So what you're going to have to do is poke holes in his premises.
Well, sure. But I can grant that. I can grant there is some being that's essence and existence are
Okay.
synonymous,
All right.
but
So if
that
we,
doesn't tell us anything about that being. That being could be
yes,
anything. It could
you're right.
be energy,
You're
could be
right.
that being.
You're right. This proof doesn't. You're right. All this does is it gets us to something that is its being is identical to its essence. It absolutely must exist. That's all it gets us to. Then there are then other proofs that you use to build on top of those that gets you to other things. And he addresses that in the Summa at like I said, at length and prima pars. We could go through some of those offhand. I haven't looked at them in a while, but we could go through them. And what he's doing is he's basing all of those arguments first on the idea that there has a being who is pure act. There has a being whose existence and essence are synonymous, absolutely simple. And then he goes from simplicity to arguments for its goodness, arguments for this being a true God, arguments for personhood, arguments for and so on. But even then, it's not going to get us to a Trinitarian God. All that's going to get us to is that God is one, he's good, he's true, and he's personal. That's
Right.
all it's going to get us to.
So I'm just addressing the first two you mentioned, the contingency and the act and potency argument. Like both of those, I can answer both of those by saying energy answers both of those. Because if we grant there
But
is
I don't see it.
something, what?
No, I'm not seeing that.
How so?
I'm not saying, because I don't see what is it about energy, the essence of energy. What is it about that essence that is absolutely must exist? We know that it does exist, but what is it about its essence that it absolutely must exist? I'm not seeing that.
Well, I'd say it's just a part of
Moreover,
its nature. It can't not exist.
okay, so I guess we're not. So I mean, and I am going to say that God is energy in a sense, right? He's pure act. Depends on how we're defining energy here, of course. If we're just defining it scientifically, we're not talking about the same kind of energy then. Because what we're talking about when we talk about energy scientifically is a little distinct from what I would say is pure act, or we can maybe call that energy. But I think that's different than what you're talking about. Scientific energy, I don't see what it is about that essence that has to be identical to its existence. That's where I'm lost.
Well, I would say the same thing about your God. I don't see anything about your God that makes its essence necessary to its existence, other than that you just asserting it. But it seems like I can match that
I didn't.
criterion and assert it about energy.
I didn't. In order to account for contingent things, we have to have something that's not contingent.
Sure.
And that's where the argument is. So it's not an assertion, it's a logical proof.
Right, but
Um,
there are infinitely many things that could not be contingent. There are infinitely many potential necessary things. So one of which could
there's
be
only
energy.
one thing whose essence can be identical to its existence.
I don't see any evidence to support that. I mean, I assume there is
Okay.
only one
So
necessary thing, but
let's make a distinct let's talk about then two things whose essence and existence are identical. Let's say you have two things out there. Okay. What's going to distinguish them from each other?
they
You
could
have
have
to
lots of
you have
additional
to
properties.
huh?
They could have lots of additional properties or different kinds of what you would describe as the way they interact
Okay.
with reality.
So then they're composed.
They can be or cannot be, either one.
If they're
So, for example,
metaphysically composed, they can't be this being that we're talking about.
so if you
They're-
define God as having like being all good and all knowing and all powerful, and you want to say those are all three like
But
non-separable properties or
that's
some kind.
that's not a metaphysical composition. That's
Right, right.
still simplicity. All when we speak of absolute goodness, absolute truth, we're speaking of a simple being whose goodness and truth are absolutely identical.
Right. So if you want
Um,
to add these properties in and say it's absolutely simple, then I can just do the same and add my own preferred
they're not being
properties.
added in, and that's where I think we have a breakdown. I think what you're describing is something that is composed,
Oh,
and
just to
anything that is
clarify,
composed,
sure, sure, but I just want to clarify for 1 second. So from my perspective, what it seems like the Thomist is doing is they're taking a bunch of different properties, all knowing, all loving, personal, et cetera, and they're compiling it into a thing, and then they just call that perfectly simple. It was like I just take the spaghetti monster or whatever and just call it perfectly simple. Obviously, it's not. It's completely ridiculous. It seems to me that the Thomist is doing the same thing. And so it seems equally justified that I can just take any alternative hypothesis with any other set of properties I arbitrarily pick and call that perfectly simple. And why would that not be analogous? Why would that not work in my case?
because that's not what Aquinas is doing in the Summa. Have you read the Prima Pars? Because it doesn't sound like you're describing anything that I've read in the Prima Pars.
Yes, I understand what he's trying to do, but I think
Have
he
you read it?
fails. Yes.
'Cause it sounds like if you have, I don't think you understood it, and that's fine because when I first read the Prima Pars, I didn't understand it. A lot of philosophical background has to go into it, and so when I went and had formal training in metaphysics and philosophy, okay, then I started to barely understand it then. But just reading it in and of itself is not going to be good enough because I think there might be some nuances that he's getting at that you're not grasping because what you're describing doesn't sound like what I'm reading. He's not adding properties. He's talking about adding properties and throwing them all together. That's speaking of a composed being. That's not what he's doing.
Right, right. I'm not saying that's what he's doing. I'm saying he attempts to do something from his worldview. And I'm saying, well, he fails. That doesn't actually work. And we can prove that
Why does
doesn't
it
work.
fail? What specifically in the prima pars fails?
His attempts to make distinguishing things like between potency and act, that's an arbitrary distinction between arbitrary, like
How do you
abstract
explain
properties.
change if it's an arbitrary distinction? How
Uh,
else do you explain change?
Change is a physical thing. Like there's actual physical
Can be,
change
can be.
between.
It's not always, but it can be. But of course, Aquinas isn't talking absolutely about physical change. You know that, right?
Right. So,
He's talking about metaphysical change.
So I'm talking two different worldviews here. There's Aquinas' worldview, and then there's physics and the stuff we can demonstrate in
And
science.
those are you're right. Those are two different things.
Right.
And Aquinas isn't talking about science
Right.
and physical change and stuff like that. So when we talk about philosophical change or metaphysical change and reducing potency to act, it's not what you're describing. So I don't think it's an arbitrary distinction. I think it's an absolute distinction that we all recognize. I think you might just be misunderstanding it.
No, no, I fully understand it. I'm not trying to mischaracterize Aquinas' argument. What I'm saying here is if I grant what Aquinas is saying and say, well, that's all just stuff he made up in his head, none of it corresponds to reality, it's just his made up hypothesis. I can make an equally good hypothesis using the same kinds of arguments he does to support a different conclusion, which means his methodology indicates nothing. It can't differentiate, well, is his methodology actually indicating something true or real, or is it just indicating something he made up in his imagination? So my argument here is to take Aquinas's method, just grant it as working, and then just mirror it and use the exact same arguments to support a different conclusion based on my own proprietary language, like he uses his own proprietary language. It doesn't
I
seem
don't
like there's
think you can though, because you recognize that this universe is composed, right?
sure.
Okay. So right there you have a problem. You have to have, if you have composition, you have to have something that's absolutely simple to account for it. And he explains this in the prima pars.
Right, but I
Um,
can grant that and just say there is an absolutely simple thing. It's just energy.
But then he goes on to explain other philosophical proofs that are based on that one thing that is absolutely simple, that wouldn't necessarily follow from that simplicity. Otherwise, you'd have to show, okay, why does this not follow, from this being that is absolutely simple? Because he goes to build on top of that. So once you've accepted that, I mean, I don't see how everything else doesn't follow unless you're just not following them correctly. And I think that's generally the case.
Right. So
Um,
my argument is we can accept the first one, accept the contingency and the
mhm.
potency act thing, and then the additional things like the all good and conscious personal
Yeah.
aspects. Those I can just replace for my own preferred arbitrary criterion and say making them work equally as well as his. So I
So you would say energy is personal?
no, I'm saying like I can just flip it out for spaghetti or something, just pick a different arbitrary property other than
But there's there
consciousness.
but when we speak about spaghetti, we're talking about something that is composed and something that
Right.
is clearly, made and stuff like that. So he's talking
Right.
about something else. I
No. So again, I'm distinguishing between his worldview and my worldview. So in his worldview, he says these things are all a part of the perfectly simple essence of God. And I'm saying of those things, he says like consciousness is one of them. I can take that and replace consciousness with spaghetti, any
No, you
arbitrary.
can't because
Wait,
spaghetti is composed, and he's speaking of an absolutely simple being. This is where you're missing
no,
it.
no. This is so haven't gotten to the end of the argument yet. So the end of the argument is this: is that his consciousness is also composed. It is a material process in the
It's
brain and
not.
nothing more. And so
It's
if you
not.
want to take that and
No.
assume that it is a simple essence kind of a thing, I can just pick any composed thing and
No.
switch it in there as well.
That's where you're wrong.
Oh, so
Our consciousness is composed because we're composed beings. Absolutely. When he speaks of God's consciousness, it's absolutely identical to his essence. That's 100% absolutely simple. There is no composition with God's consciousness. His knowledge is his essence, is his existence, is his consciousness, is his goodness, is his mirth, and so on. That's not the case with us. Our consciousness is composed. You speak of a flying spaghetti monster or spaghetti or whatever you just said. And you could just attribute all those things to it. You're talking about attributing all those things to something that's composed, and that's the problem.
so again, he asserts that this God is not composed. He asserts it
He
has
doesn't. He
consciousness.
proves. He shows how you can't have something that is composed unless it has been put into composition by something prior that is absolute
Right,
pure
right.
act. He
So
shows that. He doesn't assert it. He demonstrates that. Now you're going to have to show here's what's wrong with your premise. But you already told me you accepted his premises and conclusions. So to me, I don't know why we're having this discussion.
so I accepted just the first two, the contingency and the potency act thing.
All the other stuff follows from it because he builds it from
No, it
from
doesn't.
those.
So I can prove that false because I can
Okay.
take the same arguments and replace his asserted properties, consciousness,
By
which he asserts to
putting
be
them.
one property. And I can say, well, nope, I can just assert all of the qualities of the spaghetti monster are one property. And it's perfectly simple. And
I
it's
think you're
equally
missing
as
it.
good as the God hypothesis Aquinas is
Yeah.
presenting.
Yeah, you're missing it. That's okay though.
Well, no. I fully understand his argument. The point
I
is,
don't think
I can mirror his
I'm
argument.
hearing where you don't, but that's okay. Uh, that's fine.
No, so
Not in
again,
the
I think you're misunderstanding my
okay.
understanding of his argument. Like I see what he's trying to do. I see where it fails, like most philosophers see where it fails. And I'm describing where it fails by taking the same thing and
Most
applying it to a different ideology. And you
most
understand when I
philosophers.
apply it to the spaghetti monster why it doesn't work. You say, well, that's composed, so it doesn't work. Like, yes, which is exactly why it doesn't work in Aquinas' sense either. He just asserts it's not composed, and I can just do the same thing
No,
for the
he
spaghetti
doesn't
monster.
assert. He shows this is the logical necessity based
How
upon a
so?
pure act.
Because I can
Yeah.
prove that false. Like I can just show it's the logical necessity. The spaghetti monster is perfectly simple
Yeah.
based on
So
logical
walk me
acts.
through his argument where he goes from composition to simplicity and how he argues that something that is composed must absolutely be put into composition by something simple. Walk me through his argument.
I don't know it. Why don't you explain it to me?
Exactly. That's my point. I don't think you know. So what I would say is go back and work through it, because this is stuff that, look, you can't just sit down and read the Summa, prima pars just one time and think you get it.
No,
I mean, there's a lot of
I
work that
perfectly get
goes.
it. So, but I'm not going to try to explain your position to you. You have to, if you're defending this
No, but
position,
you
you
already
need to
accepted
present
the
it.
position. That's the problem. If you didn't accept it, we wouldn't have this discussion.
No,
You
no.
told me
So,
that you accepted it, and you tried to apply it to a flying spaghetti monster,
right.
and I'm saying, "Wait, you didn't
So,
understand
so
it to begin
you
with."
need to explain why it doesn't. That's your position. So,
Right.
me and most philosophers agree that Thomism is just complete arbitrary nonsense, arbitrary principles he's made up that don't apply to reality, which is why it's not accepted by the vast majority of philosophers. And I can take the exact same reasoning and apply it to the spaghetti monster, which is again why it's not accepted by the vast
The
majority of
vast
philosophers.
majority of
So,
philosophers aren't even familiar with his material very well.
that's
In my experience, that's
you
the
can
case. So
object to the
I
experts
really
if you
don't
want.
care about an argument from numbers, because a lot of people can be ignorant about Aquinas, and that tends
Okay.
to be the case.
Okay, but that's again, so I'm asking you to try and justify your position here. You're saying that you cannot take Thomistic arguments and apply it to the spaghetti monster. I'm saying you can, and so how do you justify your position that you can't? Essentially, you just asserted that you can't, but I'm
No.
looking for
What I would
justification.
recommend for you to do, instead of me doing the work for you, I would recommend that you go and do the hard work by reading the prima pars better, because what you just described to me is something that was very, very ignorant.
Well, I
And
have, and I have gone through it with actual philosophers, and they agree with
yeah,
me on this position. So I'm
no,
asking for you to defend your position. You say we're
no.
wrong.
Anything that is in, because he demonstrates in there, anything that is composed must be put into composition.
I didn't
Anything that
object
is,
to that.
because first of all, anything that is composed, it's distinct, right? It's not absolutely simple because it's composed. That's his argument.
Right. I didn't
Anything that
object
is
to that.
composed by definition isn't simple, and we have to have something that is simple to account for all of these other things that he's been talking about. And you can work through every one of those arguments and show me where the premises are false. That's fine. I'd be interested in hearing that, but I haven't heard it so far.
Well,
I've just heard
that's
caricatures.
what I'm trying to do here. So the consensus of experts in the field who have studied
Yeah,
this,
no,
and
that's not gonna work with me.
no,
I'm
no,
sorry.
no,
That's
no.
not gonna work with me.
So
That's not gonna
here's
work with me.
this isn't
Don't talk to
trying
me
to
about
this isn't trying to
consensus of this and
convince
that or
you.
numbers. Come on, that's not
No, no,
gonna
no.
work.
This is again, this is the argument. So the consensus of
Mhm.
experts agree that Thomism does not work
Yeah,
because
that's
you
not
can
gonna work.
apply the same arguments to the spaghetti monster.
Sorry, that's not gonna work for me. I
I'm
need something better than
asking
that.
for you to say why can't I? You keep
Yeah,
asserting you can't, but you haven't explained
okay.
how I can't. Why?
I think
What
I
is the
have, and
problem?
I think I have, and you're not understanding it. So rather than continuing to repeat it, I'm gonna encourage you to do the hard work yourself
Well, I've
rather
already
than me
done it. So again,
tell you to.
I've done through this with actual professor PhDs,
Okay,
philosophers. So again, you asserting that the spaghetti monster is a
not asserting.
composite, I can just say, no, it's not. It's perfectly simple in the same way Aquinas asserts God is. So it's not. So you're just misrepresenting my
We
position.
both know a flying spaghetti monster is not perfectly simple. Why are you continuing to use a caricature?
No, no.
And
Again,
we both know
so
spaghetti is made up of noodles and sauce, and there's all kinds of composition going on in the noodle
yeah, and we
itself.
all know
Come
consciousness
on,
is
what
too, and all
are you
powerful
kidding?
is. We know that all
This is
good
your
is.
argument.
All of those properties of God, we know those are
This is why you're
composites.
rejecting Aquinas. Look, I thought you were gonna give me something better than that. Oh, but okay,
So,
that's fine.
so you
That's
haven't
fine.
actually responded to anything I've
I
said
have
yet.
I explained that
Like
composition.
you can assert God is perfectly simple. I can assert the spaghetti monster is perfectly simple. You can
Mhm.
assert that the spaghetti monster is a composite. I can assert that
No,
God is a composite.
yeah,
Those
you're
parallel
missing it.
perfectly. So your
You're missing
assertion that God is perfect and your assertion that the
you're
spaghetti
missing
monster
it.
is a composite isn't actually a rejection.
You're missing it, which is why I not the other thing that Aquinas notes about this is, um, n not only do you have to work, through the proofs, most people aren't capable of doing it. That's the fact. So what he's saying is that, you know what? You could arrive at the knowledge of a one true God who's identical with his essence and blah blah blah. You could, but most aren't capable of sitting there and doing the work, and that's what it sounds like to me.
You can think that, but again, the
And
professional
this is why I say,
philosophers
hey,
who have
look,
studied
at the
this,
end of the day, I'm not expecting to convince you, because I also
right?
think that there's another problem. There's an additional impediment. Not only do I think that, first of all, you have to be capable of working through it. Then, second of all, I don't think we're approaching it neutrally, because I do think that there is sin that darkens the intellect and things like that. I think that's taking place with usually atheists, and some agnostics.
Yeah, those are
So
the classical
I
two.
don't expect to convince you. So I mean, that's fine. You could say that I haven't
Right. I'm
proved
not.
my
I'm not.
point.
I'm not expecting you to convince me either. I'm trying to actually
Right.
get you to present an argument. I'm just
I
interested in
did,
hearing the arguments.
and I don't think you understood it.
Well, your argument seemed to be you asserted that the spaghetti monster is a composite, and you asserted that God is
I
not a
didn't. I
composite.
just explained to you there's a distinction between noodles and the sauce, and we both know that in a noodle, it's made up of
Right.
wheat and probably has
Right.
water in it
Right.
and so on.
So
That's
listen to my
composition.
rejection
Why
of
are you
that.
playing these
So
games? You
there
know
is
that a
so
spaghetti
let me
is not
remember.
simple.
So I can copy that exact statement and say, we know that consciousness is not simple. It's a composite. There's different parts to it. You can think different thoughts. All these things. We know that that a
Consciousness is
brain.
something immaterial. We were just talking about
No,
spaghetti
no, no,
that's
no.
material.
Remember, I'm mirroring your argument. So I'm saying here is a property. You're saying this property is not perfectly simple. Therefore,
These aren't
wait.
properties. Everything in
Stop.
this simple being is identical.
So again,
They're not properties. Properties
I'm
assumes like
taking.
a substance, add in
Uh,
accidents. It's not a
I don't think you're
property.
following the argument here. So I'm making a parallel. I'm taking your exact argument and replacing the nouns. God,
Uh-huh.
spaghetti monster.
You're not.
Consciousness, spaghetti. So if you want to say that spaghetti is a composite because there's a difference between the sauce and then
Uh-huh.
the spaghetti, I can
Yeah.
say consciousness is a composite because there's a difference between the thoughts and the intentions. So if you want to say, well, no, the thoughts and the intentions, all of that stuff is intrinsically simple in God, I can just say spaghetti and sauce are intrinsically simple in the spaghetti monster.
Yeah. Look, hey, honestly, I stopped taking you seriously when you tried to apply Thomas's metaphysics to spaghetti. Like I stopped taking you seriously. I'm sorry. I thought you were going to give me something better than that.
Okay, so you don't have an objection at all to the actual philosophy behind
I
this?
do have an objection, but I don't think you're understanding it, so I'm not going to continue. I think you need to do the hard work. I'm not going to
This
do it for
is
you.
like one of the expert consensus objections of the people who've actually studied
That's
this
not
and
going to
understand
work.
it better than you
That's not going to
do.
work. That's not going to work for me.
The experts
Not
in the
going to work.
field who've actually studied
It's
this
not
and
going to work
understand
for
it
me.
better than you
Don't
do.
give me the arguments like that. That's not going to work for me.
How is that not going to
Come on.
work? Like, do you accept that there are people who
Arguments from
understand this better
numbers
than
don't
you?
work. Arguments from
I
numbers don't
didn't make
work,
a
and you
number.
know
Do you accept
exactly
that there?
why arguments from numbers don't work,
I didn't
and
make
I
an
can
argument
walk
from
you
numbers. I
through why
said,
it
do you
doesn't
accept that there are
doesn't
atheists who
work.
understand Thomism better than you do?
I would say that there probably are some, and I
Yes,
would
and I'm
think that
quoting
they
their
reject
arguments.
it based upon other reasons, sure.
And that's pseudoscience. Assuming bias is necessarily a pseudoscientific
Mhm,
argument. So
mhm.
their understanding of the concept is that you can take these arbitrary principles that Aquinas made up and apply them to an alternative that is not God, like the spaghetti monster.
I
That is
think
their objection. And I'm trying to figure out why you reject this argument.
these
Like,
atheists
what's
who know
wrong with this
better than I
argument?
do, these atheists who know Thomism more than I do, I think that they would grant what Aquinas is saying if the field was neutral, the play field was neutral, as I mentioned, but I already mentioned it's not.
That's the pseudoscience argument of assuming the people who
It's not
disagree with you
pseudo,
have a
it's built
bias.
upon already other presuppositions that I've worked through that would take hours and hours to get to.
That's just literally the pseudoscience argument that, well, you
It's
assume
not.
dissenters disagree with you.
It's
That's
not
literally,
pseudoscience.
it's literally one of the top three
We're
like
not even
reasons.
talking science when we're talking Thomism, so I don't know what you're talking
That's
about.
irrelevant to the claim. So again, this is what the experts
Thomism
say.
pertains to theology and metaphysics. It's not making claims about science. So I don't know what you're talking
Pseudoscience
about.
is not all claims about science either. There are pseudoscience that have nothing to do with pseudoscience. Like
If you
astrology
just
isn't a science. So okay, well,
Mhm.
witchcraft isn't a science. Like you don't need to be claimed to be a science to be a pseudoscience, not how pseudoscience works. So
Mhm.
again, you haven't shown how the majority of experts, their argument is wrong. Their argument is
Mhm.
we can take all this arbitrary stuff Aquinas does, apply it to the spaghetti monster. Why is that wrong?
I explain why, and I honestly can't believe you're sitting here talking to me about a flying spaghetti monster trying to be taken seriously. Are you kidding me?
Well, it's equally
Are
as
you
serious as the
serious?
theistic God. Like that's
This
kind of
is
the
really
point.
your objection?
Yes, the theistic
Look, I
God
can
is
give you better
equally as
objections to
ridiculous.
God than this.
Okay, that's
I
fine,
can
but
give you way
this is
better
again,
objections to God than this.
it's irrelevant.
This
So
is sad.
again,
I'm sorry.
your God is as silly or sillier than the spaghetti monster. So when you are making these arguments, you look equally as silly. Like everything I'm doing is just mirroring your argument word for word. So every time you bring up an objection, I just copy it and apply it to one of the properties of God. Every time you bring up well,
Copied
it's
it and
simple.
applied it to something that doesn't apply, and so I would say that you're the one that's looking, questionable at this point.
No, that's the point is you have to demonstrate it doesn't apply. You can't assert it, you have to demonstrate it.
You already agreed to it, so why would I have to demonstrate it?
No, no. So I agreed
You
there is a
already
perfectly
agreed to
simple
something that
thing,
was absolutely simple and
right?
was absolutely,
Which is the
not
spaghetti monster,
contingent.
which is the spaghetti monster, and the Christian God is a composite and is complete garbage.
Well,
It's
we're going
silly.
in circles now.
You haven't. That's because I'm still waiting for you to address the actual argument. You haven't.
I tried to. I don't think you're understanding
It's
it.
definitely possible. How am I not explaining it? Like, explain it to me.
I tried to explain to you why you're not understanding
Okay,
it, and
well,
you're
instead
not
of
getting it.
saying that, do
So
it again. Like,
I'm
try to explain
refusing
it.
to do it any further because I'm not gonna continue to entertain this.
Okay, fine. You can just bye.